Hello and welcome to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, December 12th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined here in the studio by John Walters, who is a blogger and journalist, long time covering the state of Vermont, its politics. He currently writes a blog called the Vermont Political Observer, and has reported for several other news magazines or news publications around the state, most recently for 7 days. He also spent many years as a news anchor and a host for public radio stations in Michigan and New Hampshire. John, welcome to GNAT.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you with us, and thank you for making a long drive down from Montpelier today to be with us.
Well, I piggybacked other obligations, so it's no problem.
All right, well, great. Well, it's almost January all of a sudden, and we all know what that means. The legislature is going to be reconvening in Montpelier and starting another session.
And your representatives will be making those long drives that I can't imagine making every day.
Sort of saying, wow, that drive up Route 100 there is a long haul. Mm-hmm. But anyway, when we last left off with the legislature, they were trying to kind of come up with a compromise around a couple of issues and kind of had left a few things dangling that most of us thought they would kind of figure out a way to get a statute written about, but didn't quite make it under the deadline there. Paid family leave, minimum wage, and cannabis were three areas that were kind of left dangling there. I've also been hearing a lot about carbon emissions, and green issues seem to also be bubbling up as another topic that is rising high on the list there. But I guess, what's your take? You cover the legislature pretty closely and what they're doing. What is your sense of what the priorities are going to be when they kick things off in January?
Well, I think House and Senate leadership, by all accounts, has had a little bit of a meeting of the minds over the off season, and they seem to have reached agreement after a lot of struggle on going forward with both paid family leave and minimum wage, pretty much as they had crafted them toward the end of the 2019 session. And that means if you are a small p progressive, that probably means that the outcome will be somewhat disappointing to you, because both bills were pretty strongly watered down. Paid family leave doesn't cover all contingencies anymore, and minimum wage is no longer a path to $15. It's a significant raise, but it doesn't hit that magic $15 mark. So the legislature will be able to declare victory, and they will present Governor Phil Scott with two proposals that he will have a hard time finding a reason to veto, although probably he will veto them, which then gives the Democrats ammunition for the 2020 campaign season. But I think the leadership wants to dispose of those two issues quickly to get on with whatever else is on their agenda. Now, cannabis seems to be a different matter. House Speaker Mitzi Johnson, who has always been kind of cool on the idea of full legalization, taxed, regulated marketplace cannabis, has said that it's not a priority for her, that she will let it come up through the process if it does, but she's not going to put her weight behind it, which is an interesting thing to say, and it leaves open the possibility that if there is, for instance, a key committee chair who feels the same way, then that committee chair could pretty much kill cannabis for the 2020 session. And that, again, would be a great disappointment. And if you want to talk purely politically, a missed opportunity for Democrats to give Governor Scott another measure that he would have to veto in the face of popular support. Cannabis also, the full cannabis, regulation would create more revenue for Vermont, and it would also get us out of the current muddle we're in, where cannabis is pretty much legal, but selling it isn't.
Kinda, yeah.
But CBD is all over the place, and it's kind of, some law enforcement people and some conservatives feel that the current situation is the worst possible situation because it's all over the place. It's generally available. You're probably not going to get in trouble for it, but there's no control. There's no regulation. There's no control on potency, for instance, and that's a big problem with CBD and edibles. It's also a big problem with marijuana itself because the potency of marijuana is highly variable. And if there were some sort of state oversight of the system, then you would have a measure of control over what was actually being delivered to people. And, you would have greater opportunity to limit the sale to underage people, for instance. But it's looking like cannabis will be a tough slog this year, if anything, and chances are, again, Phil Scott would veto it if it got to his desk.
Right, because I guess he's still kind of concerned about the fact that there's not a good roadside safety test available.
The saliva test measures the presence of the active ingredient in your body, but it doesn't measure impairment. And since THC tends to linger in the body, you might have a positive test, but you might not be impaired whatsoever. So that's a big problem. That's why, for instance, your Senator Dick Sears is not a big fan of saliva testing because it doesn't really show what they want to show.
Right. And Senator Sears has also been a strong proponent of passing it. I know he's mentioned several times right here that, hey, the Senate's passed this 5 times now, and what are we waiting for?
That's been a big problem with a lot of issues, is that even though the House and Senate both have strong Democratic majorities, they seem to be at odds a lot.
Yeah, really. Well, are there any other issues kind of bubbling underneath that you see kind of are going to be topics of conversation for the legislators?
Well, the other thing that's going to hit right away is the controversy that has sprung up in the last week about the women's prison.
Right. Big story.
The reports of basically a pattern, an atmosphere of abuse, sexual abuse, drug sharing, drug trading, and the complete lack of the official oversight process to do anything about it.
This was at the Chittenden Regional Facility,
correctional
the only
facility.
Women's prison in the state.
Yeah. And that's still reverberating. If anybody is listening, watching this a few days from now, chances are there will have been more news about it because it's still just rocketing around, and the aftermath of it is still very much being played out.
Right. Well, will there be some people who might not be in the same positions that they're in currently by the time we get to January or February?
Well, I don't know if it will happen that quickly, but it's hard to imagine, the corrections commissioner surviving. Although to be fair, he's only been in the job for, I think, less than a year. But he was the deputy commissioner before that, and he has been in the corrections department. He actually, Mike Touchette is his name. He rose up the ranks over 30 years, I believe, from being a guard to being the head of the whole operation. But it's hard to imagine him. My sense is that they really need to make a clean sweep of things. And I would think they just had a turnover. Corrections is in the Agency of Human Services. They just had a change in Human Services Secretary. Al Gobey left. Mike Smith, veteran of state government, is now there. If they had an AHS secretary who had been there for the past several years, I think that person would also be in trouble. I think Mike Smith can credibly be seen as an outsider who would, bring in a clean sweep. But yeah, I think heads will roll, and I think heads should roll for this.
Now, you've written a couple of blog posts in the last week or so since the story broke, being somewhat concerned about the role of the state's attorney, T.J. Donovan.
Yeah.
Bring us up to speed on that aspect of it. Do you think Mr. Donovan, who has been mentioned as a possible Democratic candidate for the governorship and challenging Phil Scott in next November's election, How does he come off looking out of this whole scandal, if I could use that term?
Yeah, I think that's the right term, and I think he doesn't look good. He has come across as someone who is much more protective of the institutions than he is of the public interest, or dare I say it, the cause of justice. He has made it, well, actually, what has come out just in the last couple of days as we speak is that Donovan knew about a lot of these abuses more than 2 years ago. Guards came up to him at a public event with prepared statements that they gave to him. And they said, there's a real problem at the women's prison. You've got to do something about it. And he didn't. In fact, what he did was he acted on behalf of the Corrections Department to reach an out-of-court settlement over a lawsuit regarding these allegations. And he didn't do anything to try to publicize the issue. He didn't try to do anything to reform the system. He doesn't have control over the prisons, but he certainly has a bully pulpit. He is the attorney for the state of Vermont, and that's part of his job, is to represent state government's interests. But he's also the people's attorney, and he is elected by the people. And he has a responsibility, I think, to serve the people's interests. And that is to not have a horribly inhumane prison system that's basically been allowed to go amok, at least in terms of the women's prison. We don't know if similar things are going on at men's facilities. But he acted completely as though he were representing the Corrections Department instead of balancing the different aspects of his office. And I think he's got to be coming in for a lot of criticism behind the scenes in Democratic circles, especially since this is an issue that touches the Me Too movement. You could put him in the same breath as attorneys who have, acted to cover up abuses in the Roman Catholic Church, or the Harvey Weinstein scandal, the Me Too movement generally, where the legal system has allowed perpetrators to get away with it by doing these quiet settlements. And that's where T.J. Donovan has come down. And I think if there was any thought of him running for governor next year, I think that's completely out the window. And I think he's going to have to do some work to repair his reputation if he wants to run for governor or for a possible congressional opening down the road. He's going to have to do some rehabilitation of his image.
Well, let's talk about the governor's race in a little bit. Right now, we have Phil Scott on the Republican side, obviously, two-term incumbent. I know he's got one minor challenger within this party, so he will have a primary to deal with, but hard to imagine him not getting through that successfully and being the Republican candidate for the governorship. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, we have Rebecca Holcomb, the former education secretary, as an announced candidate. And one would think that Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman might also be thinking that it's his time to go for the big office.
You would think so.
What do you think that's not gonna? Is he gonna sit this one out too, and give Rebecca Holcomb kind of the lane?
Well, let Rebecca Holcomb be the sacrificial lamb, perhaps. I think the only reason, until now, the only reason T.J. Donovan wouldn't have run, and still the only reason that David Zuckerman would not run, is because they don't think they can beat Phil Scott. And there basically is an acknowledgement in Democratic circles. They won't say so publicly, but a lot of them will say privately that Phil Scott's going to sail to a third term. This prison scandal might start to dent his Teflon a little bit. And it's pretty much every governor who gets the chance to serve multiple terms, finds that the shine winds off, starts to wear off after a couple of terms, 3 terms. So, this may start to show his vulnerability down the road, but I think the fact that a more prominent Democrat hasn't entered the race yet is a strong sign that they don't think Phil Scott can be beaten next year. Now, Rebecca Holcomb has some things going for her. She's very energetic. She's very smart. I think she would actually make a good governor. The question is whether she'd make a good candidate or not. She's never run for office before.
Right.
She's been an official. And running for office for the first time, you're learning a lot of new skills on the fly, and you don't have a lot of time to make mistakes.
Right.
We saw that with Christine Hallquist 2 years ago, and really with Sue Minter 4 years ago, where Sue Minter was the Democratic nominee in 2016, and she had served in the House and in Peter Shumlin's cabinet, but she'd never run a statewide campaign on her own, and she went through a lot of fumbles early on. Now, Holcomb's advantage is that she started about 6 months ago, and she's still got almost a year until the election. So she's got time to build up support, to raise money, to be a credible candidate in a way that Christine Hallquist never could, because she announced in the spring of 2018. So she does have a chance, but it's an uphill battle. It's long odds. And in some ways, she's counting on things that she can't control. More scandals would help her. And the Democratic majority, more vetoes by Phil Scott would help her to illustrate the separation between the Democratic Party and Phil Scott, who seems like he is a reasonable guy. He's a moderate in a lot of ways. And so it's hard to paint him, as Democrats have tried to in the past, as another typical Republican, trying to tie him to Scott Walker of Wisconsin or the National Republicans. It just doesn't work, because that's not who Phil Scott is. But if there are starting to be holes in his record or problems with his administration, then that starts to drag him down. I don't know that will play out in time for the 2020 election. But Rebecca Holcomb has to be, in a way, hoping for bad news that she can take advantage of.
There are some interesting wild cards also in play, I think, on the Republican side. I mean, there's a bit of a schism, it seems like, within the Republican ranks around.
Pretty much a divorce.
Between the Republican Party leadership and Deb Bellato, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Phil Scott will be running in a presidential election year when the incumbent president in the White House is fairly unpopular here in Vermont. One doesn't know how that might affect things. And I also find myself wondering if the gun control issue is going to be something that enough Republicans, or what you would have assumed Republican voters might say, but Phil kind of bailed on us on that one, and I'm still angry about that.
I think there is a lot of anger. The gun rights crowd, you have to say, they fell on their face in 2018. They didn't find good candidates to run. They didn't show themselves to be a potent political force. They can still draw a decent crowd to a rally or to a State House hearing, but they haven't shown themselves to be numerous enough to really move the needle. They had a candidate in the Republican primary 2 years ago. He went nowhere. They'll have a chance to back a true conservative this year, a guy named John Clark. But it remains to be seen whether that's enough. Now, there is a lot of conservative dissatisfaction with the governor on a broad range of issues. He's held the line on spending, more or less, but he hasn't cut spending. He hasn't cut taxes to their liking. He hasn't tried to reduce the size of government in any meaningful way. So there are a lot of people, and the Republican Party hierarchy is very much in this camp. They'd like to see someone who is more conservative than Phil Scott. The problem is they don't have anybody. There's no one of stature. There's no one in the legislature who's willing to take up this cause, who is significant enough a figure to run in a statewide campaign. You had Don Turner, the former House Minority Leader.
I was going to say, he's really the only one on the bench that might have a statewide
He's a
recognition.
pretty conservative guy in a lot of ways. He's a very nice guy. You'd love to have him as your neighbor. But he's a pretty conservative guy. He would certainly be more conservative than Phil Scott. But when he ran for lieutenant governor 2 years ago, he knew that he had to tack to the center. And so he ran as kind of a Phil Scott lookalike. And he saw that as the only path he could take to possibly winning, and he came nowhere near winning. He ran a good campaign, and he came nowhere near winning. So there isn't really anyone in the political side of things. Even legislators who are fairly conservative realize that they can't compete statewide as true blue conservatives. So there isn't anyone of any stature who's willing to take up that cause and challenge a Phil Scott or run for one of the other statewide offices, Attorney General or Treasurer or Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor.
Which is truly remarkable when you think that for, a century or more, the Republican Party ran Vermont and had an unbroken sequence of Republican governors and dominated the legislature. And to see how much that has changed since, let's say, the 1960s, when Phil Hoff first became governor, is really remarkable. I mean, I find it just incredible to see how that has shifted. Just wanted to pivot for a second and talk a little bit about your blog and what you do as a blogger, and also about the state of journalism in Vermont, which, as folks who have followed that story know, the whole industry has gone through an incredible amount of change in the past 10, 15, 20 years. The arrival of the digital era has changed the game all together. Communities that used to have fairly, solid, small local papers that focused on local news and were supported by the local economies are struggling. Newsrooms have been just decimated. Some great papers have really undergone some fundamental changes. I'm thinking the Rutland Herald and the Burlington Free Press. Very different papers from what they were 10 or 20 years ago. What's your thinking about where this is all going? Are we going to just continue to see the sort of the devolution of print media in the traditional sense, and everything's going to be online, or is there any hope at all?
Well, this is something that's being worked out everywhere. I think it's an especially critical problem in Vermont because you don't have anywhere near the economies of scale that might help prop up a newspaper operation. The biggest city in Vermont is 40-some thousand people. That's a small town in most states.
Right.
The idea that an economy the size of Rutland's or Bennington's could support a robust daily paper is pretty much unthinkable, and it's only going to get worse. The question is, what rises up in their place? There are nonprofit models now. VT Digger, which does a great job of statewide coverage, it can't get down to the community level, to the single city level very much, but they have managed to establish a nonprofit model that is sustainable with a lot of hard work. But whether that can be replicated on the community scale in a meaningful sense is a huge question to me. I think that something like, GNet TV could be a very valuable resource if it's given enough, backing to be a credible, sustainable operation to a larger extent than it is now, where it's kind of a constant struggle and a shoestring operation. We are still seeking answers to fundamental questions about how journalism works in the 21st century, and we don't know where that's going. I don't know. That has to play out especially strongly in southern Vermont.
Right, absolutely. Because we still, I think, have this feeling down here in the southern end of the state that folks north of Route 4 sort of are kind of sort of aware that we're here, but maybe not so much.
We pay lip service. I have to say that's about all that really happens. I think that the lawmakers who come to Montpelier from southern Vermont, do their best, but they're up against it because the political center of gravity is Chittenden County. And even people in places like Montpelier feel like there's too much Burlington influence over the whole process in the State House, let alone someone who might live in, Manchester or Brattleboro or, Pulteney or something like that. So I can see how, people in other parts of the state would feel, alienated from the state government process.
Right, and I suppose to some degree that's a reflection of the demographic shifts that are going on. I mean, the state as a whole, as most small rural states around the country are doing, or is struggling to hold on to population when we want to be growing it. I know Governor Scott has long talked about how great it would be if we added 10,000 people or so a year, or we can't afford to keep on losing. I think the number is like 3 students a day on average out of the school system, the public school system.
Yeah.
And down here in the southern end of the state, that demographic issue is, I think I remember seeing something recently where 3 of the 4 southernmost counties, Rutland, Bennington, and Windham, were among the state leaders in terms of lost population and lost workforce.
Yeah. And property, I saw a map of Vermont showing property values in counties, and the farther away you get from Burlington, the worse it is. And in the southern tier particularly, and in the kingdom, property values have not come close to recovering what they lost in the 2008 recession. And it's hard to see that turning around unless we find a way to bring new life to small communities. I mean, small towns have a lot to offer. When we were moving to Vermont, we chose not to live in Burlington, even though my partner had a job at UVM. We wanted to live in a smaller community, but there's not a lot of people willing to make that choice. And we need to find a way to make small communities relevant to more people and desirable to more people. And, broadband would be a big part of that because so many people are dependent on high technology digital connection for their work, or just because they're constantly using their computers and their phones. So it's always a shock to me when I drive, through central Vermont and suddenly I don't have a signal. What do I do?
Oh my God!
But there are a lot of places where that's just the case, and we have not. We've had 3-4 governors in a row who have promised to build out that broadband, and nothing happens. And there's got to be a way to do it. And there are some good ideas out there, but it isn't making any traction. And I think that's, again, because, the political center of gravity is Burlington, maybe down to Montpelier, but beyond that, that's where the population is, that's where the voters are, that's where the Democrats are strongest, and that they have the best interest of the state in mind. But when their community is doing well, it's hard to take it as urgently as it would if you were in Pulteney, where Green Mountain College just closed, or, Brattleboro area where Marlborough College is about to close.
Or Bennington, where Southern Vermont College closed earlier this year. And that was a big shock to the community, I can tell you. That was something that, while, everyone had kind of heard that there were maybe some issues or whatever, but the fact that it was closing and just sort of closed like that was a major shock, no question. We're just about out of time. Boy, we could talk for a lot longer about all of these issues, but I want to thank you, John, for being with us today. And folks, you can hear more from John on his blog, the Vermont Political Observer.
Yep, it's thevpo.org. Or if you just search for the VPO, you will get me and the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra.
Oh, okay.
And you can pretty easily tell the difference.
All right. Well, great. Well, thank you again, John, for being with us today. Really a pleasure to have you down here. And thank all of you as well for being with us today. Hope you found the show interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Have a great day.